Harold Holzer is going to talk to us about Lincoln and freedom in film and fact, a look at history and the movies, Spielberg, and the Civil War. Harold Holzer is a senior vice president of external affairs for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. A prolific writer and lecturer, and a frequent television guest, Harold serves as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2008. He has authored, co-authored, or edited 46 books, including 1863, Lincoln's Pivotal Year, co-edited with Sarah Gabbard, Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America, the official young adult companion book to the Steven Spielberg film, and Emancipating Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation in Text, Context, and Memory, which Henry Louis Gates Jr. called an essential guide to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. His latest book, The Civil War in 50 Objects, was written for the New York Historical Society, where he is currently serving as the first Roger Hertog Fellow. Please give a warm Gettysburg welcome to our friend Harold Holzer.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Not in the front, but in the back. How is that? That's about the best we're going to do. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And thanks to the Gettysburg Foundation and Joanne Hanley and Tina Grimm and all my friends who have done such a great job organizing this event. And all of you for making this 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg so special. And to C-SPAN for making it a national event, of course, as well. So it's a privilege to be part of this program. You've heard analyses of the battles and leaders from a host of expert speakers these last 2 days, many perspectives. Today I want to shift the focus a little bit for my talk, and I would like to explore the great events of 1863 with you through a different lens, through the lens of what we call American memory, as it was evolving in both art and artifacts, reminiscences and rumors, mementos as well as myth, all to honor sacrifice, ennoble heroes, yes, occasionally to assail enemies, to build patriotism, to build political loyalties, to be sure, and in the end to define what leadership meant in America, to consecrate death and the enormous sacrifice here at Gettysburg, and celebrate the antidote to death, the new birth of freedom. It's a complex and it's an often messy, sometimes even incomprehensible mixture of different media, different points of view, different motives. And it's not easy to appreciate with modern eyes. First of all, there's what I call the quaintness factor. Some of these items will look primitive to you. They're formal, they're frozen, they're kind of archaic. They reflect artistic traditions that have vanished. To understand them and what they meant in their day requires a leap of historical imagination. You have to appreciate what these so-called primitive media looked like in 1863. They were considered cutting-edge technology. A photograph that could be processed in a few weeks, a print that could be published in a matter of weeks, were considered as instantaneous a pictorial response to an event as something we might post on YouTube. So keep that in mind as you go by. And keep in mind something else. Images today are almost promiscuous. I don't mean that in a pejorative term, but they're everywhere. They're everywhere. They're on our personal devices, they're on the air, they're on our computers 24/7. In their day, images were rare, they were precious, they were collected, they were displayed, and when they were displayed, they meant something special as well. They testified to patriotism and they testified to political loyalty. All that said, it's still a tricky subject. because the images and the relics I'm going to show you are all somewhat subjective. They reflect the attitudes of the people who created them or the people who kept them. They're very personal. They reflect personal artistic ingenuity and taste, or the taste of someone, again, who took a relic home from a scene of action and kept it. A lot of these things are commercial. That is, image making in the Civil War era was not done out of the goodness of image makers' hearts. It was done to make money. So you see, out of many publishers of images in the mid-19th century, both pro-Union and pro-Republican and pro-Democratic material. In fact, I was going to say pro-Union and pro-Confederate until Abraham Lincoln banned so-called commercial intercourse with the South on August 17, 1861. Some northern image makers were putting out pictures of Jefferson Davis as well. That ended in the summer, but not until the summer. So basically what you're going to see is a northern look at the Civil War. Why? Because the southern publishing industry died out around 1862 for several reasons. Baltimore, a printmaking center, never joined the Confederacy. New Orleans, another Confederate image center, captured early by the Union. Images of Confederates, pro-Confederate imagery was banned in both these cities by the Union Army. Artists who violated the rules that governed freedom of expression, or rather limited freedom of expression, were in fact put out of business, sometimes worse, put in prison. And you'll see mostly a white perspective. Until a certain point in the 20th century, the image making was made by, of, and for white artists and customers. That wouldn't change until the 20th century, and I will show you a couple of examples of that. 1863 is a perfect year to start, and I hope the first image is up there. It's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, as you will recognize, in the high water mark of Union and Confederate battle, 1863. In fact, this was painted very, very, very soon after the Battle of Gettysburg, completed in July 1863. And it's the work of a Philadelphia artist named Edward Marchant, M-A-R-C-H-A-N-T, pronounced Marchant, I discovered only recently, who was recommended by a newspaper editor to Lincoln and spent 3 months in the White House painting this portrait of Abraham Lincoln. He called it a labor of love, so much so that he had his son, with Lincoln's permission, excused from service in the Union Army to help him in the work of the painting. A very good thing for the artist, because his son, when he returned to active service, died in the next encounter in which he was engaged. So this really did become a labor of love. But what does it tell us? What is it trying to tell us? It's trying to portray the emancipator of January 1st, 1863 in a way that is rather unrealistic. Did Abraham Lincoln wear a white tie and tails to sign the Emancipation Proclamation? Probably not. Did he pose before a statue of liberty whose shackles burst spontaneously as he signed it? Probably not. Did he pose before pillars of state to represent leadership? Certainly not. And did he use a feather quill to sign it? No, he didn't use a feather quill. So here are the artistic conventions of the 18th century brought to bear on what its artists thought should be a really formal, statesman-like image. In fact, one of the things you need to know is that paintings like this were often adapted by printmakers. But something very interesting about emancipation is revealed not just in the fact that this engraving was made in Philadelphia, but when it was made. It was made for the 1864 presidential campaign, a year and a half after the painting was released and shown in Philadelphia at Independence Hall and later at the Union League. Why did it take so long? Because for white audiences, the principal buyers of prints, the subject of emancipation, I think this suggests, was still controversial, still maybe toxic, still not a certain commercial success as a display piece in white people's homes. In the 1864 campaign, emancipation is an issue, so it elicits this campaign print. And I guess one of the ways you always can test the popularity of images is to see whether people pirate them and copy them. Copyright laws are pretty loose. So here's a rather sloppy copy of it by an unknown lithographer, also issued for the 1864 campaign. Not very good, but something for those who couldn't afford the engraving. Now, one of the ironies of the whole thing is that both the painting and the print are based on a totally outdated Lincoln. A Lincoln made in 1861, a rather rare photograph, one of them given to an old friend, mother of his dear friend Joshua Speed. And here's the original image. Lincoln was a very difficult subject for artists to capture. He was very cooperative. For a guy who always made fun of his appearance, he was always ready to pose, but he wasn't going to pose sitting still. He'll let artists watch him, but he'll be busy opening mail, writing letters. They all ultimately relied on photographs like this one. Well, whatever its complications, my co-editor Sarah Gabbard and I used it as the cover of a book about 1863, which was Lincoln's pivotal year. It was the year he decided on promulgating emancipation. But the real signing of the Emancipation was never recorded. For all of his acuity as a public relations expert, Abraham Lincoln had only 3 witnesses at the actual signing of a document that he admitted was the great event of the 19th century. Probably one of his few public relations errors in 4 years in the presidency, and certainly years building up to the presidency. So this is another made-up scene, Lincoln and Seward signing the document, but this one not issued until 1865. Again, a reflection of a little bit of sensitivity about emancipation for a while. The most famous of the Emancipation images, which I will find somewhere, there it is this painting by Francis B. Carpenter, a New Yorker who came to Washington and spent double Marchand's time, 6 months, painting this portrait. But what is it a portrait of? It's not the signing of the proclamation. It's not the issuing even of the preliminary proclamation. It's Lincoln's meeting with his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862, in which he says, "I really think the time has come for an Emancipation Proclamation." And all the members of his cabinet tell him, basically, are you kidding? McClellan has just lost in the peninsula. You have no political authority left in this country. Montgomery Blair tells him he'll lose the fall elections, the off-year elections. And then Secretary Seward warns him or advises him, wait for a military victory. And Lincoln says, I must say that's a thought I never had myself. I will postpone it. And the long wait begins that goes beyond Second Bull Run all the way to Antietam 2 months later. So in a way, this is not Lincoln announcing emancipation. You see who's listening and who's talking. This is William Seward saying, don't do it. And yet this becomes the most famous of all emancipation images. So why? Why a celebration of Seward? Well, you got to take a look at where the artist comes from in most of these situations. Francis Carpenter came from Homer, New York, which is a suburb of Auburn, New York. And Auburn is the home of Seward. So William Seward emerges as the great hero of this painting. And it does finally inspire a print, probably the most popular political print of the 19th century, but not until 1866 was this deemed worthy of popular distribution. Again, keep in mind the sensitivity about emancipation. We all know how many people applauded it. We often forget how many people were resistant and reluctant, and certainly not prepared to spend money to celebrate it. How much money? Lincoln signed on as the first buyer of a $50 proof. That was a lot of money in 1864 when he signed this. He did not live to get his copy. It belonged ultimately to Robert Lincoln. But there is his signature on the order sheet, showing that he too was a customer for celebratory images. Now, Carpenter had something specific in mind when he did this print. He wanted the liberals on the left, Chase and Stanton, liberals on slavery. He wanted the conservatives on the right, and he wanted Lincoln as the center, holding his cabinet coalition together. But again, copyright rules are a little indistinct. So if you look at the positions of these guys, take a look at a copy made by Thomas Kelly. He's moved people around, Thomas Kelly of New York. He's moved everybody around in this print of Lincoln and his cabinet and added General Grant to make use, same room, same scene, but here's General Grant. Now, Thomas Kelly had another idea, which is important in 1865, which is that the Confederate marketplace, which Lincoln closed in August 61, reopens in April 65. So says Mr. Kelly, I imagine, well, why not use this scene for another version of this print? We'll just take some other heads and put them on these bodies. And now you have Jefferson Davis and his cabinet with General Lee. I wonder how many people who bought this print in the South knew that Jefferson Davis was sitting in the White House and holding the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's another view that people in the North saw. A painting by an artist named David Gilmore Blythe, a German expressionist painter who thought he would surround Lincoln with scenes and symbols, Buchanan hanging from his neck, American flag drape, a rail splitter's maul, the Bible in his lap, barefoot, looking like the country boy who has sort of a divine moment. This too was made into a print. I only know of 2 or 3 copies that exist, and that again, this was issued in '63, too early for interest in the Emancipation. Here's another version of Lincoln writing the proclamation. Here he's got the Bible in his lap, but according to this Baltimore artist, Adelbert Volk, he's got his foot on the Bible. He's drawing ink from the devil's inkwell. There's not an American flag curtain. There's a curtain held by a vulture tieback. John Brown is portrayed as a saint in the background. There's even liquor in a decanter on a cabinet to show Lincoln must have been under the influence when he wrote such a satanic document. This is Lincoln in the North in 1863, a harried leader in his frontier shirt being pursued by copperheads, but tearing up the Constitution as he went along. Racist portrayals of African Americans and a generally ugly view of America, even from Northern artists. These are the things we don't see very often, because these are the ephemeral cartoons that people did not save. Again, it makes it very hard to pinpoint what the public thought of Abraham Lincoln in the year we're marking today, 1863. Well, we can always turn to photographs. And here's one that Lincoln posed for in '63 by a photographer named Thomas Lemaire in Matthew Brady's studios in Washington. When Lemaire said he wanted a full figure pose, Lincoln hadn't posed for one since Cooper Union in New York. He asked if the plate, the photographer's plate, was big enough to capture all of them. He said, can it be taken with a single negative? Because he had just seen a panoramic landscape on view in Washington taken with 3 separate negatives. And he wondered, maybe you'll use 3 separate negatives for me. No, the photographer said, I can get it. But as you see, didn't quite get it. And if you look around Lincoln's knees, you will see a little protuberance coming out to your left. That's the neck immobilizer that holds a sitter's head in place. But because Lincoln is so tall, they have to pile it on books. So the tripod that looks like a music stand tripod is elevated, and you can see it here. Here's another version of Lincoln in 1863, doing something we know Lincoln did, especially when he went to the photographers and had to wait between poses. He read the newspaper. We can date this photograph from the date on the Washington Sunday Chronicle. I don't know if you can see, this is just a little detail, but there's a fly on Lincoln's trouser leg, right in the creases of his fold where his legs are meeting, a pesky fly, immortalized for all time by Matthew Brady's camera. Now, does Lincoln have terrific taste in pictures? This is his favorite of that sitting. He writes, "The photograph in which the head leans upon the hand I regard as the best that I've ever seen." Well, this was not a very popular image. It looks sort of informal, sloppy. The famous frock coat looks a little bit flapping, the legs a little too long. So this one ultimately was not reproduced. Lincoln himself did not have a great idea of what would sell as images. Here's one of the most famous 1863 images of Abraham Lincoln, taken just a week or so before he came to this town to speak at Gettysburg. It's justifiably famous. It's a fabulous photograph, but I think very few of us know, and I know we've all seen it, this was, again, not known in 1863. In fact, this picture did not become popular until the people who inherited the photographer's plates started issuing them in the 20th century, around 1901. Why wasn't it popular? Well, why wasn't it known? Such a great sitting. Well, here's another photograph taken that day, and I think it gives a clue. No one would use this photograph as a marketing device, a side view in which Lincoln is almost turned away from the camera. The answer can be found in John Hay, his private secretary's famous diary, in which he writes, "Went with Mrs. Ames to Gardner's gallery and were soon joined by Nico," that's John Nicolay, Lincoln's chief secretary, "and the president. We had a great many pictures taken, some of the president the best I have ever seen. Nico and I immortalized ourselves by having ourselves photographed with the president." And here they are. But the clue was, went with Mrs. Ames. Who is Mrs. Ames? She's a sculptor, and she has just won a commission to make an emancipator statue of Abraham Lincoln, a commission from the Congress of the United States. She commissioned a side view because she wanted it to make the bust of Lincoln from the side. And here's what she did. A tough picture to recreate. I wanted one that showed you the side view. But here it is. She got a healthy commission from Congress. It stands outside the galleries today, not far from where Francis Carpenter's Emancipation painting is, on the second floor of the U.S. Capitol on the Senate side. So there's a reason behind these images, why they were seen, what they meant in their time. And these famous images of Lincoln, alas, did not mean a great deal in 1863. People of the time simply couldn't decide what Lincoln represented at the time. Neither could London Punch. Was he a great warrior like the gladiators of old? Or was he a rather timid peacenik who basically wanted to restore the Union without a fight? This commander-in-chief of the greatest army ever assembled on the planet was only portrayed as a commander sporadically. And in this one typical image, he's using a log rail to combat Jefferson Davis, a plantation man with a sword, with a broadsword. People have a hard time defining Abraham Lincoln in 1863, for all of our knowledge retrospectively that it was a pinnacle year for him and his presidency. Well, that brings us back here to the cemetery, to November 19th, 1863. He was an afterthought, as we know, invited to deliver only a few appropriate remarks, never really totally visible in any of the photographs taken. Here's one that was discovered a couple of years ago, and a close-up of a man on horseback with a black mourning badge on his arm. Is it Lincoln? The jury is still out. I think it's being reanalyzed now. We're not sure, but it's intriguing. Here's another plate. Josephine Cobb of the National Archives 50 years ago thought there was something in this image, and she had it blown up several times. Once, twice. And there, bareheaded, next to John Nicolay in the center of the picture, not the man in the top hat, that's Ward Hill Lamon, Lincoln's bodyguard and the master of ceremonies at the Gettysburg ceremonies. But there, bareheaded, looking down, is Abraham Lincoln on the grandstand at Gettysburg, just a few moments away from immortality. Lincoln, of course, was not photographed while he was speaking, the excuse being he spoke so quickly, he got up and down so quickly, no one had time to make a plate. There's something else there, I don't know what it is, because certainly a photographer had plenty of time to set up during Edward Everett's long 2-hour address. Maybe something will still turn up, we don't know. One person who looked at it retrospectively and from an African American artist's point of view is this fantastic 20th century portrait by the great artist William Johnson. Lincoln speaking to a gallery of ghosts at Gettysburg. Or Lincoln speaking but also presiding over the burials that took place in anticipation of his arrivals and of the ceremony of November 19th. I like this portrait particularly because William Johnson has the same name, ironically, as the African-American valet who accompanied Abraham Lincoln to Gettysburg. And as my friend Gabor Borit wrote in his great book, The Gettysburg Gospel, retelling a story that had been lost for many years, William Johnson helped Lincoln when he caught smallpox on the way back from Gettysburg, treated him, and then died of smallpox himself, no doubt contacted from Abraham Lincoln, again in that strange, complicated year of 1863. And of course, here is the way Gettysburg is remembered, an evening scene in the Steven Spielberg movie. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but there's also an African-American story here, because as you will recall, those of you who saw the film, the African-American soldiers who visit Lincoln that day improbably recite the address back to him, something the white soldiers are unable to do. Would an African-American soldier have known the Gettysburg Address in 1865? Would a white soldier have known the Gettysburg Address in 1865? I don't think so. But that's the kind of conflation of memory that I want to deal with in a few minutes when we talk further about the film. Of course, there's the speech itself. This is the copy that Lincoln did later for an album for Baltimore, for a sanitary fair in Baltimore. And then the organizers went back and said, well, we can't have it on the front and back. This is actually the front and back of a single page. You have to do it again. So he did it again on 3 pages. And this is the copy that's now in the White House. This is President Clinton showing me the picture in the White House. I just thought you'd like his outfit. He's actually wearing a t-shirt that says Camp David, the presidential retreat. And I thought, what other Camp David could it be? Like a Jewish summer camp in the Catskills that I didn't know about. But he was very specific. Now, pictures can lie. This is a picture of me getting a lot of applause at the Capitol Visitor Center after a showing of the movie Lincoln. But it's really because of the guy I'm standing next to. You can do anything with pictures. This is a good lesson. Never stand next to Daniel Day-Lewis for any reason, especially if there's a camera around. So I want to tell you a bit about my involvement with the movie. This is what the wonderful actor wrote to me afterwards, saying, you've been with me every step of the way. Actually, I wasn't with him every step of the way because his method, which is beyond method, doesn't allow for 20th century or 21st century people to be on the set. So while I was a script consultant to the movie and did this young reader's book, for the film, what I did was look at the script, and here is the script that I had to keep secret for so long. And you see it's marked, so you can't Xerox it without giving yourself away. And here are the little tab notations I made with comments. I haven't counted them, but basically 2 of my suggestions were taken and X were not taken. And we'll get to that a little bit later, and how important it is. Maybe not as important as we would think. The film got many things more right than historians or contemporaries. Here's a Harper's Weekly image of the celebration in the House of Representatives on the passage of the 13th Amendment. All whites. In fact, the little vignette of African Americans entering the House chambers for the first time in a large delegation is absolutely true. Spielberg wanted that in the film, and it's in there, and quite movingly. I must have something. Oh, yes. Well, what can you not get right? What do you have to guess at? Maybe the character of William Bilbo, the lobbyist. Yes, he was a real Albany lobbyist. As a New Yorker, it hurts me to say that he was a real Albany lobbyist, but he was. And yet James Spader and the makeup people made it up out of whole cloth, because now I get my question mark. There is no known image of Mr. Bilbo, probably for very good reason, unless it's on a wanted poster somewhere, but they had to invent it. And that one scene in which Lincoln comes to their rooms and Bilbo says, we're having a hard time bribing people because they don't want to accept money with your currency coins with your face on them because they hate you so much. Well, there were no coins with Lincoln's face on them until this coin, not 2009, but 1909. So one of those little things that is a little bit of a speculation or artistic license. Casting is important. You've got to get someone who can do it right. Only an actor like my friend Stephen Lang, who's sitting here, can play Pickett and Stonewall Jackson a few years apart. But you have Elizabeth Keckley, the formidable dressmaker to Mary Lincoln, who was also a leader in the contraband movement. She was about the same age as the actress who played her, but a little bit of a world of difference. You know, today's 50 is yesterday's something else. Here is William Slade, who succeeded the late William Johnson as the valet and butler to Abraham Lincoln. Also a formidable character. In Washington, also a major force in the contraband movement and the contraband relief, raising money. And here is William Slade as channeled by Stephen Henderson. Not bad, I think. And of course, Thaddeus Stevens from these necks of the woods nearby. There he is, and not bad. Not bad in the hands of Tommy Lee Jones. Maybe the accent was a little Texan for that New Englander, but still a real effort to come close to reality. As for William Henry Seward, our artist, Carpenter's favorite, David Strathairn comes about as close as I think you can get. And I look for this profile to make it work. You can't get those kind of noses with prostheses. Casting can't always recreate the people in films. I mean, how do you do Francis Preston Blair Jr. unless you consult an actor who's been dead for 20 years? That's really the only way you can do this. So Hal Holbrook does it for us. And that's, for those of you who didn't realize what a great piece of stunt casting that was, you may remember, for those of you old enough, Hal Holbrook also played Abraham Lincoln in the great Sandberg's Lincoln miniseries, in which he did a really terrific job. And so here he is back in the Lincoln film of 2012. Well, Mary Lincoln didn't need Lizzie Keckley's example to dress beautifully. She dressed beautifully. She's about 43 years old here. Sally Field is about 70. She looks great. And there she is in a very good, she looks better than Mary in my view, but who am I to pass such judgments? But again, they worked hard at recreating the Mary. And here's Lincoln posing again for Mrs. Ames. Not very different from the profile they used for the movie posters and for the principal photographs. So how do we account for some of the differences between fact and fiction in the film? This is Steven Spielberg at Gettysburg last year. I don't know how many people were were able to hear him speak here or watched it on C-SPAN, but he gave a rather powerful explanation of the way he views his art. And I wanted to quote from it because I don't like to get caught up in the nitpicking about the film, as much fun as we can have with it. He said, "Nothing matters more than memory," and that's the subject that we're addressing today. "Without memory, we learn nothing. There is no coherence, no progress. But even with history that's as scrutinized as that of the American Civil War, some aspects, some details are gone forever. We can't remember everything. History forces us to acknowledge the limits of memory. And one of the jobs of art is to go to impossible places that other disciplines, like history, must avoid. Through art, we enlist the imagination to bring what's lost back to life, to bring the dead back from life. This resurrection is, of course, just an illusion, a fantasy, a dream. But as we all know, dreams matter." And I think that's about as eloquent an explication on why we have to be tolerant, in fact grateful, for all of the artistic renderings of this period of Lincoln's life. Lincoln on the March for Freedom, Lincoln on the March to Gettysburg, Lincoln on the March in 1863. I wanted to close the talk, at least spend a few minutes, as I seem to have tried to weave this talk around 3 books. I don't want to give any time to the Connecticut congressman who objected. There's Spielberg. Okay, the book. The Civil War in 50 Objects. And this brings up another part of Civil War memory, and that's precious, one-of-a-kind touchstones about the war. The Historical Society, where I serve as a fellow, invited me in and asked me if I would help them choose 50 objects and make a book that told the story of the war through relics, paintings, and documents. They said, "We'll put them out on a table." I could not believe what they had. I'm not sure anyone knew what they had, but these objects really tell an extraordinary story. They tell the story of Caesar, the first image in the book, the last slave in New York. He was so old when New York outlawed slavery that he was exempted. People over 70 were exempted from liberation because the philanthropic, quote-unquote, feeling among the legislature was that they would be turned out and left to their own devices and would not be able to survive. How long would they live anyway? Well, Caesar lived over 30 years. He was over 100 when this daguerreotype was taken, looking as noble and dignified as any person of his age, in the year of the Compromise of 1850 that enacted the most brutal fugitive slave laws known up to that time. A pike ordered for John Brown and his army as it marched into Virginia to conduct their own liberation. Why a pike? Even someone as messianic and enlightened as John Brown did not believe that African Americans were capable of firing real weaponry. So he armed them, he hoped to arm them with these almost medieval weapons to fight for their own freedom, an aspect of John Brown's campaign that has been long forgotten. New Yorkers like to forget that our mayor of the time, Fernando Wood, was a secessionist, that he made his own treaty with the governor of Louisiana and other states to continue trade with the Confederacy after secession, that he held an anti-union rally in New York trying to get New York out of the Union, and that he did so even before Abraham Lincoln got to New York en route to his inauguration. When Lincoln met him, everyone was very nervous about that meeting at City Hall, and Lincoln was very calm about it. He simply said, "I reckon the front door is not going to set up housekeeping on its own." And of course, it didn't. This is hard to read, but it is a letter from a New Yorker to his mother. He goes south, as a good number of New Yorkers do. "I have no friends in the North," he says. "I owe it nothing. The period I passed in Bayou Sarah in my childhood made more impression on me than all the rest. If a kid were born in a stable, meaning a baby goat, would it be a colt? No. People like me a resolve to stand for Southern independence and to maintain it to the bitter end. New York was a house divided, as was the entire house. There are testaments to early heroics. This is a huge painting of the return of the 69th Regiment to New York after the Battle of Bull Run. The irony here is, as magnificent as this painting is and as expensive as it was to produce, Manassas was not exactly a great victory for the North, and the commander of the 69th, Colonel Marr, was actually captured and held in a Confederate prison. So all we see of him is the little image on the right. A newsboy is selling prints of Colonel Marr. A little side story about the popularity of prints. I know the USS Monitor made its bones in Hampton Roads, Virginia, but it was made in New York. It was made in Brooklyn. And here is the half model that its builder took to Washington to show a disbelieving, crusty old naval board and Abraham Lincoln. This is the model that he saw. And when the naval board said, we can't commit money and do a double-step construction project on this loony thing with a revolving turret, they said to the president, what do you think? And he said, well, there are two versions of this story. I'll tell one of them. He said, it strikes me as what they said when a beautiful woman put her foot in the stocking. I think there's something in it. And this was green-lit. Lincoln is an emancipator, but here's a petition that was sent to him from New York with 800 signatures begging him to free the slaves and to arm African Americans in the fight to save the Union. It's 25 feet long. It's in that same Historical Society collection. It's got famous New York names like Whitney and Dodge and Vanderbilt. It's got Henry Ward Beecher. It even has somebody who signed his name, John Brown, a little post facto. But it is also multi-ethnic. O'Rourke's, O'Flaherty's, Jewish tailors from Manhattan. It's an amazing rainbow of voices for freedom from New York. And in the New York collection is this sketch of slaves coming into freedom in Vicksburg about 100 years ago from today. I'll come back to this image a little bit later. Here is a Vicksburg newspaper, the last issue of the Vicksburg Daily Citizen, one of the rarest wallpaper newspapers ever published. Published on wallpaper because Vicksburg has no more real paper after this, during the siege. And on July 3rd, 1863, it publishes its last edition that admits the banner of the Union floats over Vicksburg. General Grant has caught the rabbit and brought his dinner with him. That's a reference to Grant vowing he'll have dinner in Vicksburg by Independence Day. And the Vicksburg Citizen lives to see it. No more will it eulogize the luxury of mule meat and fricasseed kitten. This is the last edition and is accepting this note from the types as we found them. What does it mean? The Union soldiers broke into the newspaper office and printed a little extra article saying, we are here, and then destroyed the presses. Newspapers are so important in the Civil War. This is an astonishing piece. It's a prison newspaper, handwritten, maybe one of only a few copies. Prisoners, these are Confederate prisoners, on Peach Island in Fort Delaware, have such a yearning for news that they create news about their own prison, where to get debating clubs, where to find dental work, tailoring, a musical association, a chess club. Only 4 copies survive, maybe only 4 made. And this is an April 1865 edition. The prisoners were probably liberated soon after, but they had the intelligence to keep this piece. This is a draft wheel. This is an actual wheel from the Lower East Side of Manhattan that was to be drawn in 150 years ago next month with the names of conscripts into the Civil War. All the draft cards are still inside because a few hours before these names were to be drawn, a riot erupted on 3rd Avenue and 46th Street in New York City. If you're ever there, look at it now. No marker, no plaque, but that's where it started. Spread up to the south end of Central Park, moved west. Draft offices destroyed, newspapers attacked, private homes sacked, burned. Maybe 1,000 people died. atrocities committed against African Americans, lynching, genital mutilation, a story that I personally think hasn't been sufficiently told in New York, where I'm hoping it can still be told next month for the 150th anniversary. And here is maybe the most evocative of all the relics of that disaster. On 5th Avenue and 43rd Street, there was a building called the Colored Orphans Asylum. It was a beautiful building, great ventilation, classrooms, sleeping quarters. A lot of the orphans were the children of U.S. colored troops who deposited their kids there so they could fight for freedom and for union. During the draft riots, a mob marched to this asylum, broke in, set fire to the mattresses in the bedrooms, and the building burned. As the mob formed, there were some people who yelled, "Don't let the children out." The minister inside, who was in charge, said, "Children, follow me. I'm carrying the Bible, and God will lead us to safety." This is the Bible he was carrying. It's charred on the edge with smoke, and maybe more. The children did escape. No one molested them. And though the crowd was principally Irish American, one Irish American in the crowd said, "Follow me," and took about 60 children to a nearby police station. They were transferred to Roosevelt Island, and they were saved. It has sort of a happy ending to a horrible moment in New York history, again, that I think should be marked. Just one block north of that monument to learning, the New York Public Library. An interesting Gettysburg relic from a soldier named Paul Jones Semmes, cousin of Raphael Semmes, the admiral, who is injured at Gettysburg and writes to his wife, "God has spared me," very much like what the minister said to the children. "I have taken only a slight wound. I am in transit to Virginia." A day after this letter was written, he died of those wounds, probably infected, and who knows, maybe never even recorded in the casualty lists of Gettysburg. An item I didn't know about, a Ben Butler silver medal. Now, we all have our images of Benjamin Butler, the general who imposed martial law in Maryland, the beast of New Orleans, maybe, the man who was called Spoons Butler because somehow when he left the occupation of New Orleans, there were no more silver spoons left in town, and yet his bank account was really larger than when he got there. And yet, after his last and terrible military command at Wilmington, North Carolina, the victory that we see dramatized in Spielberg's film, he saw African American soldiers fighting and commissioned a silversmith at his own expense to design a medal in their honor. Maybe these are from the spoons that were melted down from New Orleans, I don't know. And of course the military brass in the United States said, "You can't give out this medal. Only the Army gives out medals. You're not allowed to." Well, he gave it out secretly to all the heroes of Newmarket. And he wrote years later, "Since the war, I have been fully rewarded by seeing the beaming eye of many a colored comrade as he drew his medal from the innermost recesses of his concealment." Here's an unknown document testifying to how close Lincoln thought he came to losing the 1864 election. On one of his visits to the War Department, also seen in the movie so memorably, he takes some time to chart his path to victory. Remember Tim Russert's famous card with electoral votes in 2000? Here's Lincoln's thoughts that he will get just enough to win by 3 electoral votes, forfeiting New York, Indiana, and even Illinois. No one knew that he had done this. There's another copy where he gave himself a few more votes, basically by counting Nevada, which was admitted to the Union. But here's a guy who thought that he might not survive for a second term. One of my favorite items, the surrender terms. Lee's surrender to Grant, as written by Ulysses S. Grant on a newfangled set of carbon papers that he had bought in Washington the day he was made Lieutenant General in 1864, had them with him in Appomattox. And when he wrote the surrender terms, he wrote it on this, it was called a manifold. And after Lee had left, he gave one copy to his aide, who had been so moved by the event that he was unable to write the terms himself. Colonel Eli Parker, a Native American. When Lee left the scene, he shook hands all around, shook hands with all of Grant's staff. And when he got to Parker, a dark-skinned man, he stopped short and looked at Parker and said, "Well, at least there's one real American in this room." Not the friendliest of comments. And Parker looked straight back at Lee and said, "General, today we're all Americans." This is the surrender term that Grant gave to Eli Parker, his Native American staff aide, presented later to the New York Historical Society. Well, we may be frozen there. Here is just a testimonial from Clara Harris, the woman who was in the theater box when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And she says something that historians have overlooked, as have the purveyors of blood relics of the assassination moment. Bloody clothes, bloody dress of Laura Keene, the actress. She writes, this is an attestation that my fiancé, Colonel Rathbone, bled profusely, but the president bled not at all. All the blood in the box was his. So next time you see an eBay offering of a blood-stained something from the assassination, have it checked with Major Rathbone's DNA. I want to return and leave you with this. At first glance, it was a wonderful piece on its own terms because it's an original sketch made for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper by an anonymous artist. And it just had a little inscription, "Slaves from Chickasaw Plantation arriving at General Grant's headquarters." Well, I looked into that incident, and it was pretty fascinating. These are slaves who freed themselves under the terms of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Those who still embrace the false myth that the Emancipation did not free anybody, please look at this picture and understand that African Americans and armed forces of the North were empowered to bring liberty to areas that they conquered throughout the war, from January 63 on. Who are these African Americans walking into Union lines under the terms of the proclamation that they heard about? They are Jefferson Davis's own slaves. They were from his plantation in Mississippi, and boy, he was ticked off when he found out that his slaves had used the proclamation. So how much does it matter what's real, R-E-A-L, what's real, R-E-E-L? Of course it matters. We like things to be factual then and now. And whether it's Steven Spielberg blending the record in 2012 or artists and photographers who dramatized and bent and blended the record in 1863, the motivation hasn't changed much. It's the impulse to romanticize and glorify and teach and inspire. It's still relevant, it's still important. And the impetus has not changed for the urgency to interpret the year 1863, the high watermark for Civil War art in memory in many ways, and the year that certainly changed American history. Lincoln said it in a wonderful way in 1863, not the famous words, but words he had the ill fortune of writing while he had smallpox a couple of weeks later and sent to Congress for his annual message. And of course they got subsumed by the Gettysburg message, but they're pretty good. And this is what he said to conclude the year of 1863 that I've just tried to re-examine with you today. We stand indebted to those who have lived and led through these perilous times in behalf of the home of freedom disenthralled, regenerated, enlarged, and perpetuated. Thank you all very much.